Okay, well, let me welcome you to Water Policy in Texas, implications for landowners and easement holders. My name's Todd Weiler. I'm the moderator. Yes, that's what I am. And I would like to introduce our three presenters slash panelists this morning. They're each going to give a presentation, and then we're going to have a Q&A session after that. And since one of them is getting coffee, I will start with the others. First of all, we have Dr. Robert Mace. He is the Deputy Executive Administrator for Science, Water Science and Conservation for the Texas Water Development Board, where he's worked since 1999. And he has a very extensive resume. I'm not going to read all of it, but I will tell you that he is the father of the GAMS. And if you are associated with water in Texas, you would instinctively know that those are the groundwater availability models, and their development has been critical in terms of water management in the state of Texas over the last decade or so. And Robert is a graduate of the, New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology. I know that because my father-in-law went there, and when we all get together, they all talk about their days in New Mexico, where he has, Robert's got a BS and an MS from that institution and a doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin. And next, right here, we have Stacy Steinbach. She is the Executive Director for the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts. And she is a former attorney with the General Land Office. She's active with the Texas Water Conservation Association and the Texas Water Conservation Advisory Council. And she has a degree from Baylor in biology and ecology and a master's from Texas A&M, and has her JD from University of Montana School of Law. And then on the far left there, there's no symbolism in that, is Ken Kramer. Ken is the Water Resources Chair of the Sierra Club, Lone Star Chapter, and for 23 years he was the first state director of the Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club. Ken has a history degree from Texas Lutheran. Oh, that's interesting. It's right where G. Beret is in Seguin. And an MA in political science from Stephen F. Austin, and a doctorate in political science from Rice. And let me just tell you, you really could not have three better panelists talk about water today. And we are going to go ahead and start off with Dr. Mace, who is going to talk to us a little bit about the drought.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let's see. This is the third year I've been here to talk about the drought, so I'm sure a lot of you are bummed to see me here again this year. I suspect I'll get the day back once it starts raining again across the entire state. Last year when I gave this presentation, it was titled "The Trees in Texas Are Begging for Dogs." They are still begging for dogs in much of the state. As Todd mentioned, I'm just going to give you a status of what's going on with the drought right now. There was a vicious rumor I was going to talk about goats, but my understanding is Stacy's going to talk about goats. So if you're here for goats, hang on. This is a slide here, or a cartoon. The mean dude says, "I was busted for being in the Outlaws motorcycle gang. You?" And the fellow on the right says, "I watered my lawn." We're still in drought in Texas. Things have gotten better, of course, since 2011 in most of the state, but not all the state. And precipitation-wise, things are looking better, but when we take a look at our water resources, things aren't looking so rosy. There's more to the story there. Here's the current U.S. drought monitor for the United States that shows drought across the nation. Last week and even the week before, suddenly in the press there was a lot of stories about the drought in California, because right now in terms of the national drought, that's where it's focused. That deepest, darkest Aggie maroon color means bad. It's the worst level of drought. We've got a few little bits of it in Texas, but all those colors from orange up are drought. Yellow is a transitioning into drought or a transitioning out of drought. I think in Texas, where you see yellow, that is a transitioning into drought. We seem to be going back into a more severe drought situation since we haven't been getting rainfalls over the winter months, or at least substantial rainfall. A little close-up on the drought. Basically, about 60% of the state right now is in drought. Some flavor of drought from moderate to exceptional. And when we look at severe and worst drought, it's 27.5% of the state. So, things look better. And I put this slide up last year, although I've updated it. It's kind of the proverbial frog in the pot that when compared to 2011, when Mother Nature really turned the heat up on us, and most of the state, in fact, 88% of the state was in exceptional drought, that deepest, darkest, worst drought category. The dials come back a little bit. Things feel better, but ultimately we're still in hot water in terms of the drought in Texas. This is a plot I've borrowed from the state climatologists, and it shows time horizontally, and then the PDSI, which is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is the way the pointy head folks measure drought. When you go below where you see the months listed out, that's drought conditions. All those squiggles up there show various historical droughts in Texas since 1895. The orange squiggle there is the drought of the 1950s, which as far as a statewide drought is concerned, that is the drought of record, and remains so for much of the state. You'll see a drought that is also quite long, 1961 to 66, and then that black line there is the drought that we're currently in. And so you see it dipped down, actually in 2011, worse in that year than it was in any year in Texas past, and then we've seen some recovery. And actually over the last 12 months or so, we've actually seen quite a bit of recovery, but we're not completely out yet. It'll be interesting to see what form that black line takes over the next year or so. This is a plot showing outdoor burn bans. Last year when I showed you this map, most of West Texas was underneath that burn ban. So we've gotten some rainfalls to make things better than they have been. But again, we're still seeing precipitation issues out west in South Texas. And in fact, we're starting to see developing drought conditions along the Gulf Coast. This plot shows statewide reservoir storage since the 1940s. The black jagged line is the total amount of storage that we have available in our reservoirs. More accurately, the reservoirs that we monitor, which are most of the major reservoirs. And so as we build a new reservoir, that line shoots up. So you can see we've had a great deal of reservoir development since the 1940s, and a lot of that happened after the drought of the 1950s. It served up as a wake-up call. And then really since 2000, development's been pretty flat. We haven't had any new major reservoirs come online. The line underneath that shows how full those reservoirs are. So how much water do we have in the water bank? And hopefully you can see on the right-hand side, what's been happening statewide with reservoir storage. And we're still pretty low. Typically, again, when we go into the winter months, we'll get fall, winter, spring rains to help fill up those reservoirs or bring them back up. But we're not seeing that this winter so far, and we really didn't get a whole heck of a lot of a bump last winter. So that's not good news for our water resources or the water that's in storage. But like in many things, there are haves and there are have-nots. And Texas, of course, varies quite a bit rainfall-wise, and it might not be a surprise to know that reservoirs in East Texas are doing a whole heck of a lot better than reservoirs in West Texas. And kind of the dividing line is pretty much right up the middle of the state. I-35, although we're starting to see declining reservoir levels, going east of I-35 as the drought's starting to peek its head back into towards East Texas. Ironically, those of you who are here in Austin know, Austin proper last year has done quite well rainfall-wise, and in fact, some parts got 13 inches in one day. Actually, they probably would prefer not to have gotten 13 inches in one day. But it hasn't rained where our reservoirs are out west. So it creates this interesting situation, particularly folks that aren't enlightened about their water resources say, why do I have to keep restricting the watering of my yard when the drought's over? And it's like, yeah, but have you been out to Lake Travis lately? Speaking of Lake Travis, here's what Lake Travis looks like. And of course, I'm from Austin. This is my water supply, so I keep a look to see what's going on there. And it's, we've just not seen the recovery. It's down to 36%. If you're following the news related to the management of the Highland Lake systems, this has been in the news with respect to water releases for rice farmers and other users downstream. It's very controversial. If you go back, you can see in the left-hand side of that chart the drought of the 1950s. And golly, boy, what we've been seeing the last few years sure looks a lot like what happened in the 1950s. What's going to be key, again, is what happens as we go forward in time through this year and in coming years as to whether or not this drought continues and how severe it gets for water supplies in this part of the river basin. Here's Lake Spence, Thomas, and Ivy, water supply for Midland, Odessa, San Angelo, among others. Kind of see things started going to hell in the probably the mid-1990s, late 1990s, and they've got a little bit of a bump early last fall, but continuing a downward trend. Elephant Butte, this is the reservoir. If you saw a lake sticking out in the middle of nowhere in that statewide map off to the left, you kind of thought, well, looks like they screwed up. Nope, that's Elephant Butte Reservoir. It's in New Mexico, and it's an important source of supply, not only for New Mexico farmers, but for Texas farmers in the city of El Paso. And this is a fascinating chart to me. Keep this in mind, it almost looks like a square wave. Things were looking real good, then it was all real low, then things were looking good, and then really since the mid to late 1990s, things haven't been looking very good. File that away, we'll talk about that briefly in a bit. I hesitate to call it a neat picture. The geek in me thinks it's neat, but there's what Elephant Butte looked like in 2013. I'm sorry, I got those dates switched. I was like, what am I talking about? Apologize. Yeah, if only. Wishful thinking. Yeah, it was a Freudian drought slip there. My apologies. On the bottom is what on the top is what the reservoir looked like in 1994. Obviously full of water, and then on the bottom is what it looked like thick of summer last year, and it really hasn't. It's improved a little bit since then, but really it's still looking pretty pitiful. And that's reduced deliveries of water to El Paso. They're having to employ their other water resources. Looking out ahead, this is the U.S. seasonal drought outlook showing what might be coming, and it's not good news. Pretty much everywhere I showed you earlier where drought is active now in the nation, it's expected to continue through the end of May. This is a projection out through the end of May. And then even worse news is the yellows you see are drought development likely. So these folks from NOAA are expecting continued drought and then a developing drought in Texas. So again, not good news. This is kind of a critical time period to be looking at this because this carries us through the spring where we're hoping we get some spring rainfalls to replenish soil moisture and to replenish our reservoirs. Once you start getting to May, well, then you're getting into our standard dry, hot and dry summer months. So this is a little troubling. Looking a little further ahead is what's going to happen with El Nino, La Nina. We've currently been in La Nada, which means we're in a neutral condition in sea surface temperatures in the mid-Pacific Ocean towards the east. Of course, if we have El Nino conditions, it tends to mean wetter conditions for Texas, particularly in the winter months. However, El Nino is bad for tropical storm or hurricane development coming over into the Gulf of Mexico and benefiting Texas, because the El Nino winds tend to shear apart those tropical systems. So it's kind of gives with one hand, takes away with the other. La Nina just tends to correlate with dry conditions in Texas. So the good news, depending on which hand you're looking at, looks like perhaps looking out, we may be trending towards weak El Nino conditions, but that's quite a long ways out at this point. It's a little premature. I probably personally don't believe these projections except about for 3 months, in which case we're looking at a continuation of neutral or la nada conditions. And then wanted to end with this slide, which is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. There are other oscillations, sea surface temperature oscillations out there that appear to impact the weather in Texas. And this is one that's in the northern Atlantic. And what's interesting here is that if you think back to that plot I showed you of reservoir levels in Elephant Butte, does this kind of look a little familiar to that? And so the suggestion here is when the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, what the cool kids call the AMO, is bad for Texas when it's in that red warm condition, tends to be drier here. In fact, the last time we went through a full phase, and you can kind of look, mid-1920s up until the early to mid-1960s, we had the Dust Bowl, we had the drought of the 50s, and we had that big drought I showed you in the 60s. And then we had a good time for Texas where that plot is blue, where we had greater than average rainfall conditions. And then lo and behold, mid to late 90s, it switched. My observations, and I'm not a climatologist, but my observations of looking at this and looking at reservoir conditions is the signal or the impact this has on our climate is stronger the more west you go. And so Elephant Butte almost looks like a square wave that follows this. We see this, I would say, in Lake Meredith, or at least I see it reflected in Lake Meredith. I think conditions in reservoirs in West Texas starts to break down as we get into this part of the state, but the drought kind of ebbs and flows and it starts poking its head towards East Texas, and we're kind of in one of those situations now, at least in the central part of the state, as well as up in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Waco, and San Antonio. This plot only goes up to like 2011. I tried to find a more recent one. We're still in an AMO condition, but note that it's called multi-decadal. It tends to last 20 to 30 years. We're only probably a little bit more than halfway through it. So longer term, there's an expectation that we're in a greater propensity for drought for the next 5, perhaps 15 years. Just full of good news. I don't know why you invite me back every year, Todd. But look on the bright side. At least we're not in California.
If you're wrong, we won't have you back.
Hey man, I've been right so far. And I always look to see what John Nielsen Gammon is saying, since I'm not a climatologist, and he's saying much the same message, that there's a greater propensity, not a guarantee, there's a greater propensity for drought in the future. So with that, are we going to save all questions to the end, Todd?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Okay. Good grief. Where's her? There we go. No, that's not it. Is that it? Is that it? That's not it. Oh, your PDF. I'm gonna let you.
Okay, Robert, you destroyed the internet somehow. So next we have Stacy Steinbach, and for those who were just getting here, we're running a little late, so we're going to keep the questions to the end, where we're going to have some discussion on the panelists, and then we'll try to open it up the last 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience.
All right, let's see if I can work this. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Good morning. All right, now I'm ready. As Todd said, I'm Stacy Steinbach. I'm with the Texas Alliance of Groundwater Districts. We're essentially a trade association for groundwater conservation districts in the state, so we're very much like TLTC is for land trusts. We have about 85 GCD members and about 24 consultants, hydrogeologists, lawyers that are part of our organization. And so I'm really glad to be here. I've been here as an attendee many times. I've never been here as a speaker. TLTC and land trusts are important to me, and not just because my better half, many of you know. Todd gave me the impossible task of giving a GCD overview, talking about groundwater ownership, and then touching on some emerging issues all in 15 minutes. So this is going to be the very fast 101 overview. I know some of you this will be review. For some of you it might be new information, but we'll just get right into it. The way I start any GCD talk is the rule of capture. Again, I see many friends in the audience who have been working on groundwater issues for many years, and you're very familiar with this, but for those that aren't, the rule of capture, the take-home message here is it's not an ownership doctrine. It's a liability doctrine. If Todd and I live next door to each other and Todd decides to, say we have 100 acres each, and Todd decides to sell his water rights to Ozarka, and they come in and put a well, and they pump so much water that my well goes dry. The rule of capture says that I can't sue Todd for making my well go dry. So that's why it's often called the law of the biggest pump. And the thing with the rule of capture, it doesn't provide a lot of certainty. And it provides no protection, because no matter what you do with your groundwater, the adjoining landowner can access that water. And we all know that it's all connected. Oops. So insert the GCD. In 1917, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Conservation Amendment to the Texas Constitution. That was the start of the framework for creating GCDs, but it wasn't until 1950, when we'd had some drought, that we had some statutory legislation that created the framework for GCDs. And that first GCD was High Plains Underground Water Conservation District number 1. That's a 16-county district that governs the Ogallala. And I borrowed this from the Joint Planning Statute, which we'll talk about in a minute, but this is what GCDs aim to do, where you have rule of capture where there's no balance, right? Whoever with the biggest well wins. The GCD's aim is to balance the highest level of groundwater production with the conservation and long-term health of the aquifer. And so this is what a GCD is trying to do every day. I like this slide because it shows a history of GCDs. This is from our friends at Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District, actually just down the road. The yellow districts, you may not be able to read those dates, but the 50s and 60s, those are the yellow districts. You can see they're large. You can see they're mostly Ogallala districts. That's when we had concerns about the drilling for irrigation up in the Ogallala. The green districts are between the 60s and 1996. You can see those are a little bit bigger, but not very many. And you can see the blue districts since 1997. And what happened in 1997? We had Senate Bill 1. And that's when the legislature said groundwater conservation districts are the preferred method for managing groundwater in the state. So what happened? We had a huge proliferation of groundwater conservation districts, and we have a lot of single county districts you'll see. So I'll talk a little bit about how we overcome challenges associated with that in just a minute. But what do GCDs do? How do they manage groundwater? The first thing, contribute to a scientific understanding of the aquifer. They work with Dr. Mace, consultants. They're collecting data all of the time. They also educate and inform the community, as many of you all are familiar with those efforts. The other thing that the public mostly knows about is the regulation of the drilling of wells and the production of groundwater. This is when you got to go to your GCD and get a permit. And finally, they participate in joint and regional planning. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go over that last one. And when I used to talk about joint planning in a presentation, I had this slide that said, you know, the GCD to the GMA, to the DFC, to the MAG, to the TWDB, and you're all saying, OMG, I cannot follow this at all. So really, to boil it down, the DFC is the desired future condition. This is essentially what the aquifer is going to look like at a specified time in the future. So most of those are 50 years because that's what our state water plan process is on. An example of a DFC in the Ogallala is we want 50% of the aquifer remaining in 50 years. Another example of a DFC might be we want 20 feet of drawdown of the aquifer. Another example might be stream flow. We want this spring flow or stream flow to be held consistent. And so the GCDs get together in what's called a GMA. It's a groundwater management area. And so what the Water Development Board did was they put GCDs in groupings according to the aquifers that they are over. So they're kind of aquifer-based management areas, I guess, so to speak. And so they get together at those GMAs and they consider 9 factors. And this was amended in 2011. I know many of you followed that process, but they consider private property interests, socioeconomic interests, current uses, rainfall, all of these things, and they implement that balancing test I showed you earlier. Highest practicable level of groundwater production with the long-term health and conservation of the aquifer. And this is a really important tool for districts because then they go back to their local area and they have to manage total groundwater production to achieve that DFC. So if their DFC is 50% of the aquifer remaining in 50 years and so much water is pumped that only 25 is left, well, you're probably not achieving that DFC. So it's a really important management tool that districts are using. And the reason I say this is important from a landowner perspective is because this is where landowners can have an impact. Public participation, it's kind of like a rulemaking at a state agency. And so there's a lot of public hearings, there's a lot of public comment, and we're right now going through the second round. The first round was before Senate Bill 60 when this was implemented. And so they're going through the second round right now, and it's really important as land trusts and as your landowners, they know what's going on because this is the management tool. So let's jump from GCD snapshot into groundwater ownership. I know many of you are familiar with some of this, but I do want to touch on it. These are the important cases. I'm not going to go over all of these, but they're in the PowerPoint. The big take-home message here is that in all of these cases, the Supreme Court never said groundwater is a private property interest. They never said that outright. Now, it could be implied, it could be perceived, but a lot of times what they said in some of these cases was, we look to the legislature to determine that question. And so they kept kind of prodding the legislature on that, but it wasn't until 2011 when Senate Bill 332 came out where the legislature said unequivocally, the landowners own the groundwater beneath the surface as real property. But what they also said was GCDs can limit or prohibit drilling based on spacing or tract size. So this is chapter 36 of the Water Code. GCDs can still do what they're doing. It's just like a county or a municipal ordinance, zoning, that kind of thing. They can still regulate even though you own it, but you do own it. We want to affirm that. And I know, I see Kirby in the audience. I know many of you were very involved with that process. So Day was a case that some of you have heard about, and that case was pending at the Supreme Court. This case started in the late 90s. In that case, just a little factual background, there was a well that was used in the 60s and 70s, and at some point, the casing collapsed and the pump was removed. But it still was flowing under artesian pressure to a tank about 100 yards away. And so the Days requested, under the EAA, now remember the EAA is created a little bit differently than all other GCDs. It has a specific statutory act. In that case, we had endangered species concerns, remember, and I know Todd could talk about this a lot longer than me, but basically the Fed said, you guys are having a take of endangered species because we got endangered species. If you permit or use too much water, we're gonna have to come in and do something about it. And so the EAA Act was passed. And under that act, they let historic users come in and prove up their use. And once they proved up their use, they could get a historic use permit to use. And so the Day said, well, we've been irrigating peanuts and other crops for these years, and so we want 800 acre feet. And the EAA said, well, actually, when that water came out of that well and went into that on-channel pond, it became surface water. It wasn't groundwater. So we cannot give you that 700 acre feet. We're only going to give you what actually came from the well. And so the issues that went through the courts were, one, did the EAA err in reducing the permit? Did the EAA follow its statutory mandate and do what it was supposed to do? Two, this was the big question we'd been waiting for all along. Can the regulation of groundwater constitute a taking? And three, so we know whether or not it could be a taking, was the EAA's action a taking? And so we got answers in 2012. And the Supreme Court said no, the EAA did not err. They did what they had to do under their statutory mandate. But can the regulation of groundwater be a taking? Yes, that was the first time the Supreme Court said that. So it was a huge thing for Texas lawyers, water lawyers. And then third, and all of Texas actually, did the EAA's action constitute a taking? Well, they said, we don't know. This case has been going on 12 years, but there's not enough in the record. We're going to send it back down to the district court to find out. So just some highlights on the reasoning there. They said the rule of capture and ownership in place are not mutually exclusive. This is fascinating to me because if I own my groundwater in place, but the rule of capture says Todd can pump so much water that my well goes dry, I can't sue Todd, but I can sue my government. This is the only ownership interest I know of where you can't sue your neighbor for taking your property, but you can sue your government. So it's really interesting to see how this is going to play out. But the court did affirm the property interest in groundwater is subject to the rule of capture and GCD regulations. What we had happen after Day was a lot of folks coming to the GCD and saying, oh, well, Day came out, I own my groundwater, you can't regulate it. And the court said, no. You do own it, but it is subject to reasonable regulation by GCDs. And the third bullet is Penn Central analysis. I won't put you to sleep with that, but essentially these are the three things that they look at when they're looking at whether a taking is. That was a Grand Central Station, New York City case that was at the US Supreme Court, but it has gone through all of jurisprudence, and that's what most courts look at. So economic impacts, well, there were economic impacts, investment-backed expectations, and the nature of the regulation. Those are the three things they're gonna look at. So again, they said the EAA acted in accordance with the act, but they did not say whether a taking occurred. We're never gonna know whether a taking occurred. They settled the case. So where are we now? Enter Bragg, EAA v. Bragg. This is another case, same time frame. There were two pecan orchards. The Braggs used Edwards water on one, on the other they did not have historic use. They applied for permits on both tracts of land. The EAA issued a reduced permit for the historic use tract and outright denied the other permit. The Court of Appeals, so this is not at the Supreme Court yet, so we're still gonna be seeing how this plays out. But the Court of Appeals found that the EAA, again, they did what they were supposed to do under their statutory mandate, but they applied Penn Central and said, economic impact, investment-backed expectations, there was a taking here. And the other thing they determined was the compensation was based on the value of property immediately before and immediately after that permitting decision. So what do we know? Because there's a lot of gray area here. We know that land ownership includes a constitutionally protected ownership interest in groundwater. We know that doesn't preclude regulation by GCDs. And we know that some limitation of groundwater production isn't a taking. Those are the three things we know. What do we not know? How much regulation is too much? Is an outright denial gonna be a taking? You know, you have some cities that tell landowners within the city limits that they can't drill wells at all out of concerns for the groundwater quality. So that's an outright denial. So is that gonna be where the first taking comes in? Another question is there a distinction between EAA and Chapter 36 GCDs? Remember I said the EAA is kind of a different bird because it was created with an EAA Act by the legislature, which has kind of a statutory cap. GCDs also have DFCs they have to manage too, but there's a little bit more flexibility. And so we're not to that point where GCDs are having to say no like the EAA had to say no. How will different uses be affected? A lot of GCDs allow for historic use permits. That's where this investment-backed expectations come in, right? If you've been using it all this time and putting in this infrastructure, how is that gonna play out? Also, we've got certain uses, maybe oil and gas, that has exemptions. How is that gonna play out as we talk about groundwater ownership? Will there be unintended consequences? Are you gonna see districts have a fear of saying no because of the takings litigation and how costly that might be? And then finally, how are damages calculated, but we'll follow Bragg and see how that plays out. Some private property considerations I wanted to put in before I close up. Again, I already mentioned Penn Central and historic use. Another one that I think about a lot is where does the legacy landowner fit in? I know many of you work with these landowners who want to conserve their land for generations. And not only their land, but maybe their groundwater. Well, no district allows a permit for non-use. So how do those folks get a seat at the table to make sure that their water is conserved as they want to? Surface water, groundwater transfers, it's just an interesting topic. I'm not suggesting any changes to it, but right now it's easier to transfer groundwater across the state than it is surface water. And so maybe that discussion will come up. How can conservation easements affect groundwater? I have thought about this a lot and I'm not really sure because even if you put a conservation easement on groundwater, if the next door neighbor can pump that groundwater, then is it really that effective? And so that's one of the things I want this group to think about and how that might be a tool. And finally, aquifer storage and recovery. I think this has a opportunity to be a really powerful thing for water planning, but also landowners as they sell storage rights. So not groundwater rights, but they can say storage rights. You can store your water here and I won't pump that water. And finally, to close up with some emerging issues, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk more about this. Those of you who follow the legislative session closely know that every single one of these issues was up during the 83rd session, and that not one of them passed during that session. So that tells me they will all be back. Right now, I'm working with all of these gentlemen on, TWCA is working on consensus language on some of these issues. I'm sure there will be bills on all of them. A big one you've probably heard about is brackish groundwater. Our concern about brackish groundwater was that it's not like we have these separate bathtubs of brackish groundwater and this separate bathtub of fresh water. So when you pump brackish groundwater, which is great, we encourage that, we want to make sure it's not impacting the freshwater resources. One, freshwater levels, because it's the same bathtub, but also causing more mixing and making that freshwater become more saline. And not only that, we've got some areas of the state where the GCD, all of their water is what we would consider brackish. It's over 1,000 TDS. And so we're working on that issue. It's very, very technical and complicated. You have a lot of hydrogeologists acting like lawyers and a lot of lawyers acting like hydrogeologists, and it's yeah, Oscar. So anyway, and finally, I think we'll see some new GCDs. I always say nobody wants a groundwater conservation district until a water marketer moves in, and I think we are seeing that more and more. So we'll wait till after questions, and I'll let Ken go. Oh, that's not it. Oh, he doesn't. Okay.
Yeah, don't look for it though. Unless this is Todd's computer and he stole one of my presentations. Well, thank you. Again, I'm Ken Kramer with the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club. The last slide that Stacy put up on the screen from her PowerPoint presentation sent shivers up and down my spine. It wasn't so much the list of issues, it was that coming soon 84th legislature. Really is a terrifying thought. Todd has asked me to do the next to impossible task, which is to explain surface water in Texas and also touch on the most recent, probably most visible legislation in Texas dealing with water, the passage of Proposition 6 and House Bill 4, which has set up new funding for trying to provide a financial mechanism for projects in the Texas Water Plan. And the implementation of that process is, I think, going to be very significant in terms of how Texas addresses water issues in the coming years. So let me give you sort of a thumbnail sketch about surface water in Texas, trying to make about 5 quick points, and I really do want to spend probably most of my time talking about House Bill 4 and Proposition 6, because I think that's been on the mind of many people in this room and many people in the state in the last several months. In Texas, we have this convenient legal fiction that there's a difference between groundwater and surface water. Well, that's great from a legal standpoint, certainly gives a lot of attorneys a good bit of work to do. But I think most of you probably understand that at least some of us believe that it is a legal fiction to say that there's a distinction between groundwater and surface water. There are so many connections in so many places in Texas between what water is under the surface and what water is on the surface. Spring flows being an obvious example, that to continue this legal fiction, I think, really creates a lot of problems for us now and in the future in Texas. But we do have that legal distinction right now, and we certainly need to think about water in that context. Unlike groundwater, we haven't had as much uncertainty in Texas over past decades about surface water ownership and rights. Basically, what is considered surface water in the state, the water in our rivers and streams and lakes, is basically owned by all of us in this room, held in trust for the public by our state regulatory agencies and the Texas legislature, but allocated to many of us through what are known as surface water rights or water rights permits. And these are currently basically issued by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. It has been a situation where different agencies by different names have allocated those water rights in the past, but today it's TCQ that provides this service. Excuse me. And so if you, as, let's say, an industry, a municipality, an agricultural producer, want to have access to surface water, and you don't, and you need that surface water for more than what's considered a riparian right, which is basically surface water being used for domestic and livestock purposes by a landowner, then you have to go to TCEQ to get a water rights permit, or you have to go and make a contract or an agreement with somebody who already has a surface water rights permit for being able to use a certain amount of water. Now, this is a very interesting and different concept from what we have in groundwater in Texas in a legal standpoint, because basically surface water operates under what's called the prior appropriations doctrine or system, which I think is true that most other Western states actually apply that kind of doctrine to groundwater management and not just to surface water management. But under this prior appropriation doctrine, you have the necessity of going to a state agency to get that water right permit or to contract with somebody who already has a permit. Now, one of the interesting things about surface water rights in Texas is that it also operates under a doctrine known as first in time, first in right. And what that indicates is that basically, if you are a surface water rights permit holder, you have a priority date that is basically going back to when you got that permit, or to be technically correct these days, it's when your permit application was administratively complete, and assuming that water rights permit is issued, that's what your priority date is going to be. So if you got your surface water rights permit in 1910, or your family did, I assume that most people here were not old enough to get a surface water right permit in 1910, then you have basically a senior water right over anybody who has gotten another water right in that same basin, that same body of water at least, in a subsequent period. And theoretically, under these kinds of drought situations that Robert was talking about earlier, as a senior water right holder, if there is a limitation on the physical water in the stream, and basically you have a senior water right that needs to be protected, you can make what is known as a senior call to TCEQ, asking that basically they cut back on other people's surface water rights, the people who are the more junior or the later water rights, so that you can exercise your water right. Now, there's been a little bit of a twist in that doctrine or that concept in the last couple of years in the 2011 drought, which, as Robert mentioned, was the single worst drought year in Texas recorded history so far. During that year, there were a number of senior calls made to TCEQ for surface water rights where there was a shortage in a particular basin. And in a number of instances, TCEQ did not necessarily shut off or reduce the water rights to some of the junior water rights holders. If those junior water rights holders were, for example, municipalities or power plants that, for purposes, as TCEQ said, of public welfare and safety, needed to have some guaranteed water to be able to exercise their public functions. And that has caused a good bit of consternation and discussion about, well, have we really sort of violated the first in time, first in right doctrine for surface water rights, and what are the implications of that for the future? I mean, obviously there is a pretty logical argument to be made that certain public purposes, like providing water for health and safety in a city, or providing water to make sure a power plant is able to continue to operate, might have a higher priority for society than somebody who wants that water for a specific industrial or agricultural use. But the law doesn't really say that per se, although I think it is true that TCEQ has some flexibility under the law to operate on behalf of public welfare and safety. So that's a very interesting thing. Another point that I want to make is that I'm sure many of you may be aware of this if you're aware of how surface water rights operate in Texas, and of course the growing population industry we've had over the decades. And that is the vast majority of surface water rights in this state have already been allocated. There are a few basins where there is the possibility to get additional water rights or new water rights. And certainly there may be the possibility for getting what are known as term permits or interruptible permits so that you have the water for a certain period of time or under certain conditions, but not in perpetuity. But most of our water in the state has, in terms of surface water, has been allocated on the basis of water rights that are basically held in perpetuity. And so if you have a water right that you got in 1910, you pass that water right on to your heirs, and basically your heirs continue to use that water right and be able to exercise it. So the majority of surface water rights in Texas have been allocated. And that means that with our growing population, we have a great deal of challenge ahead of us in terms of how we use surface water and whether or not new enterprises can have access to new surface water rights. Another point is that, and this from the perspective of an environmentalist, is that unfortunately, the vast majority of surface water rights in terms of volume that have been allocated in the state were allocated prior to 1985, and they were allocated with very few exceptions without any permit conditions to protect the environment. No permit conditions to require releases for in-stream flows, freshwater inflows for basin estuaries, to impact water quality and things like that. 1985, the passage of what was known as the water package that year, was the first time that the Texas legislature said that basically all permits have to have, or actually I should say, have to have considerations for environmental flows. But we've already allocated the vast majority of surface water rights in Texas without those kinds of conditions. And so for those of us who are concerned about protecting in-stream flows and protecting freshwater inflows to basin estuaries, we have another challenge ahead of us. Now, fortunately, from an environmental standpoint, we have been in relatively good shape in most years in terms of maintaining river flows and maintaining freshwater inflows to our coastal basin estuaries, because most of the surface, or I should say not all the surface water rights that have been issued have been fully utilized. In other words, we have many municipalities who have water rights far above what their current needs are, and so they're not diverting or taking as much out of the river or stream as they have the legal right to do. Because once you have that surface water right, you can exercise that entire right. And actually, you can basically reuse that water through the concepts of direct and indirect reuse. So you have the ability basically to keep that water from being returned back to the stream. And so our bays and estuaries, relatively speaking, have remained healthy because we have not necessarily been utilizing all of our surface water rights and taking all that water out and keeping all that water out. We tried to address this process a few years ago with Senate Bill 3 and set up a process to determine what environmental flow needs were in each major river basin and then have standards set to try to protect those flows. But the process, while it's made some accomplishments, has not actually achieved the goals that all of us had wished. And in large measure, it's because major surface water rights have already been allocated. We don't have a lot of water that we can reserve for the environment. So we have many challenges in surface water, and many of these issues are still going to be dealt with, and I think they're going to have to be dealt with in creative ways because of the legal system that we've set up. Now, let me just turn real quickly to House Bill 4. We can talk a little bit more about this in the question and answer, and Chairman Rubenstein from the Water Development Board is going to be here tomorrow. Excuse me, so he's going to probably talk a little bit more about this. I think most of you are aware that last legislative session, Texas legislature adopted several new laws to try to fund projects in the state water plan. And eventually what they decided was they had to take the final approval to the voters in what was known as Prop 6 in November of last year, which they did so. And they got basically an overwhelming majority approval. About 3/4 of the voters approved passage of Proposition 6. And basically, even though it wasn't on the ballot per se, what the approval of Proposition 6 meant was that the legislature was taking $2 billion out of our so-called rainy day fund, which is an interesting name for this process, and putting it into a new fund, the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, and its corollary fund, which is a revenue fund, and using it as the corpus, as the capital to build potentially over 50 years as much as $27 billion that could be used in state financial assistance to help pursue projects in the state water plan. Now, this was highly controversial in many ways, and it may well be that some of you in this room were opposed to the passage of Proposition 6. It was not a cut and dried issue for many of us, but a number of statewide environmental organizations supported it in large measure because of two major things. First of all, for the first time, the legislature said to the regional planning groups that come up with our components of the state water plan and to the Water Development Board, you have to come up with a way to prioritize the projects that you are proposing in the water plans, and you have to look at criteria like cost effectiveness, sustainability, viability and feasibility of a project, when it's needed, what its impact on water conservation is going to be, how it addresses water loss. And so for the first time, we had really some, I think, significant criteria that the regional planners and the state water planners were directed to use in deciding whether or not a project or a strategy should even go into a regional water plan or state water plan in the first place. Now, how that's implemented, of course, is going to be the real key, but having that as a principle, as a directive for the planning process was extremely important. The second thing of most interest to the environmental community was that there was a set-aside, if you will, in the funding that said at least 20% of the funding has to go to conservation or reuse projects. Another 10% has to go to rural projects, and those rural projects can include agricultural conservation projects as well. Never before has the legislature dictated to the Water Development Board that a certain amount of funding has to go for water conservation. And that was a very important principle from the standpoint of the environmental community. Now, many people have said, well, there's waffle language, you don't have to do it. Well, there is some waffle language in there. One of the reasons there's some waffle language is that in order to even be considered as a conservation project by the Water Development Board for funding, the regional water planning groups have to include conservation projects in their regional plans in the first place. So if they don't include conservation in their regional plans, if the potential sponsors of those conservation projects don't go to the Water Development Board and seek money for those conservation programs, then the Water Development Board may or may not be able to reach that 20%. That's one of the reasons for the waffle language. But I also want to point out that the Water Development Board very clearly, and you'll hear this from Chairman Rubenstein tomorrow, sees that 20% conservation as a floor, as a minimum, and not as a ceiling or a top. And so my challenge to all of us in this room, including myself, is that we have to work hard to make sure that conservation is a key component of the management strategies and the projects in the regional water plans around the state. We have to encourage various water user groups, political subdivisions in this case, to go to the Water Development Board and seek funding for conservation. And we have to make sure that the Water Development Board defines conservation in a way that actually allows us to utilize those funds for true conservation purposes. So I've covered a lot. There's a lot more I would like to say, but maybe we can discuss some of these things in question and answer period. But the bottom line of this is that we have a lot of challenges ahead of us in Texas on water. And you've heard from Robert and Stacy about the challenges with drought, the challenges with groundwater. We have challenges in surface water and how we actually manage that surface water. And we have challenges in determining what are the proper strategies that we use in our regional and state water plans, and how do we fund the projects that really get us the farthest in terms of meeting our water needs. So I'm grateful for the fact that water is the issue that I'm most passionate about because I have no lack of opportunity to delve into the water issue on a daily basis. And so those of you that know that I'm retired, please be assured that what retirement means is that you get to be busier and work harder. You just don't have to worry about being compensated for it. So thank you.
Okay, so I was making some notes while the three of you were talking, and you may have to turn your mics on. Not sure they're on. Are they on? Okay. So I want to welcome our three panelists, or our three contestants, I'm sorry, to the lightning round. And remember, the answer to every question contains 10 words or less. And I have a question submitted by one of the panelists for another panelist, and it has to do with goats. And I'll find out whatever that was, after we finish this. But I would like to start off and ask a question about the drought. And the question I have is, looking, in the western half of the state, how low the reservoir levels are, what type of problems are some of the cities in the western half of the state whose reservoirs are not quite dry? Well, Meredith is completely dry, but some of these other ones are nearing that. What type of problems are they going to anticipate this summer, and what can they do about them?
Well, folks in West Texas have pretty serious problems with respect to water resources. Obviously they can't build a reservoir by snapping their fingers. Folks say it takes 20 to 30 years, so they can't build a reservoir to solve the problem. If they look underneath their feet at groundwater, what they find is not a whole lot of ample fresh groundwater, and furthermore, not a whole lot of ample brackish groundwater to use for desalting. And so one strategy that a lot of communities are looking at out there is reuse. And in some cases, a direct blending reuse, what some will call direct potable reuse. And so the Colorado River Municipal Water District has a plant operating now that treats wastewater, completely scrubs it clean all the way through reverse osmosis, and then merges it with their raw water supply in a pipeline, and then it goes through conventional surface water treatment. Wichita Falls is actually they have a plant right now in testing phase that does a similar thing, and Brownwood is looking at that as well. So that's been kind of an interesting development, and also El Paso is in the process of looking at doing a project like that. Sorry, more than 10 words.
Ken, you want to add something?
In addition to what Robert's talking about, which is a little more long-term, obviously the most immediate thing that West Texas cities and others finding themselves in a drought situation need to do is to implement their drought contingency plan, and perhaps actually take a closer look at whether or not their drought contingency plan is as strong as it needs to be given the situation we're facing right now. And by drought contingency plan, I mean that a number of entities did this on their own, but back in 1997 with the passage of SB 1, one of the provisions of SB 1 required various entities to develop drought contingency plans and submit those plans to the state. And then those plans are now required to be revised every 5 years. The universe of entities that have to do drought contingency plans has been expanded, and these are very important. Robert mentioned Wichita Falls. I was at, I seem to be at a water conference every day. I was at a water conference in San Marcos on Tuesday of this week with a speaker from the city of Wichita Falls, and he talked about their present operation in terms of moving to the wastewater reclamation and use. But he also mentioned that the citizens of Wichita Falls have been very responsive to the implementation of the city's drought contingency plans because they've been in drought for a very long period of time. And they've actually, within, I think, 2 or 3 years, cut their per capita water consumption on a daily basis from almost 200 gallons per capita per day to slightly over 100 gallons per capita per day. And this has allowed them to stretch their increasingly dwindling water supplies. It's not the total answer. It's not going to get them out of the crisis they find themselves in right now. But it's very important that the drought contingency plans be a part of how cities respond to immediate drought needs.
And I'll just add to that if I could. That's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. If you live in a city and you've been told you can only water twice a week or once a week, then you've been benefited from the implementation of, I was going to say victimized, but you've benefited from the implementation of your drought contingency plan. And Wichita Falls has been, at least for several months, no outdoor watering allowed at all in response to the drought.
You want to add anything, Stacy?
I would
You
just
don't
add-
have to.
Well, you know, this is something I think about just living in the city of Austin and seeing our green lawns. And one of the things we have, and I used to be a mud lawyer. I represented municipal utility districts, and so this came up a lot. But we have these systems where, you know, we implement water restrictions and outdoor watering. But like the city of Wichita Falls, the other side of that is they're now selling half the water that they were selling previously. And so a lot of these municipalities have bonds to pay off and have to make the money. And so we got to find ways to structure it so that they can get their money while we also encourage, thank you, conservation. And that might be through stair-step approaches, and I know a lot of municipalities are doing that now. But we got to make it so that the municipalities want to encourage conservation and it doesn't affect their bottom line, right?
Yeah, and there are ways to do that, and the Alliance for Water Efficiency is putting together a tool to help communities design billing systems to deal with that. And another way to perhaps look at that, in fact, there was an article earlier this week in the American Statesman about having a drought fee that gets implemented, and not only does perhaps that help with surely it would help with income issues from water utilities, but then also it serves as a further disincentive to perhaps use water outside.
Right.
Okay, and just because Robert mentioned that sparked something else in my mind. It just so happens that on Tuesday this week, in addition to a water conference in San Marcos, the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club and the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina issued a report on this very topic about how utilities can address their twin goals of trying to promote water conservation while maintaining fiscal responsibility and their revenues. And if you go to the Texas Living Waters Project website, just Google Texas Living Waters Project, the link to that report is on that website. It's also on the website for the Environmental Finance Center for University of North Carolina. And don't ask me how we partner with North Carolina. It's a long story.
I'm going to ask a question about groundwater, but I probably should remind you that we are videotaping, and you may or may not be under oath. I don't really know at this point, but you might want to think about that. So why? I'm going to ask you this, Stacy. Why is groundwater law such a mess? I mean, let's just get.
A lot of it keeps lawyers employed. That's why. In this state, I think that Ken hit on that. We treat surface water and groundwater differently, and most states don't do that. And I sometimes in my talk I say, where are we in kind of the road to figuring out our groundwater law? And I mean, maybe halfway there. I don't know. We've got a long way to go. And I'm not so cynical that I think it's to keep groundwater lawyers employed. I think it's because in Texas we're a little bit unique, right? We value our private property interests, and that's a good thing. But it creates some challenges as we talk about required conservation, and that's where the private landowners come in, is encouraging them to kind of implement those conservation strategies because the state can't force it.
Anybody else want to?
They didn't
add
even want
to
to
that?
answer
They
that
don't
one.
want to. They don't want to.
That was a
Well,
tough
I
one.
will ask them this. I will ask you this, and you could answer the last one too. But the uncertainty of our groundwater law, does that not increase the pressure to develop surface water resources?
Well, I'm sure that increases the uncertainty for certain groundwater projects, and I think that may have been part of the San Antonio Water System's decision, at least at a certain level, recently not to make an agreement with potential groundwater marketer from Val Verde. But you often hear it said that, well, there's actually more pressure on groundwater because there are restrictions on the transfer of surface water from one basin to another that were imposed by the 1997 law, SB 1. And those conditions, among other things, basically say that if you have a surface water right in one basin and you want to transfer it to another basin and you get permission from TCQ to do it, you have to get a permit from TCQ for that, that water right or that volume of water that you're transferring basically becomes a junior water right in the basin. And that many people see as a impediment to moving surface water. Now, Sierra Club is actually neutral on that point, but there are certain other conditions on the movement of surface water between basins, which we agree with, like the water conservation condition. And I think many people see that as an obstacle to moving surface water. So maybe we should just think about trying to use or manage our water more efficiently so we don't have to move a lot of groundwater, surface water around the state and incur the energy cost as well as the other cost of doing so.
Robert, did you started to reach for the microphone at one point earlier?
Yeah, then a voice kicked in my head that said, keep your mouth shut.
Yes.
You have to remember that Robert's the only state agency employee out here.
Yeah. So a few years ago, people thought of brackish groundwater, and they thought, oh, I have brackish groundwater. Now they think, hey, I have brackish groundwater. And so our system has got to change a little bit to account for this, does it not? Because many of the ways that we've managed groundwater, we've never really even thought about the the brackish groundwater portion of it in some instances. And so what does the increasing recognition that is a valuable resource mean for groundwater conservation districts and also for groundwater law?
Well, I guess I'd offer from the very beginning is that groundwater law doesn't have to change to incentivize the production of brackish groundwater. Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District down the road is a perfect example of a district that went through the DFC process, created a DFC for their brackish resource, and they issue permits for that brackish groundwater that are not as stringent as their freshwater sources. So the framework is in place, but with that being said, I recognize the need to maybe incentivize to push that so that we have folks that have a little more certainty. So for the districts that might not be doing that. And so what we've been working on is ways to make that available. We want to think about private property considerations. The bill last session might have allowed just basically 30-year or longer permits with unlimited production. And if you're a landowner in that area and a desal plant comes in and is just going to pump and you don't have any opportunity to get compensation for that, then you might want a seat at that table. And so it's really, I think that we have a chicken and egg thing. We don't really have the data maybe that we need just yet, but we do want to incentivize it and use it. And so that's what we're working on, is ensuring adequate safeguards so that districts can step in when necessary to protect current users, but also making sure that we do incentivize the use of that resource.
Several years ago, the Water Development Board funded a study to do a planning level look at brackish resources in Texas, which is where the 2.7 billion acre feet of brackish groundwater and storage comes from. However, that's a pretty broad overview, and so I've got a group of folks now, in fact, that are focused on getting additional data, better characterizing the brackish aquifers of the states, or the aquifers that have brackish water in them, hopefully to help provide some of the data once brackish groundwater is on the table as a water resource, and then also hopefully be a database that communities or people looking to use water can employ to use as a screening tool to determine whether or not they even should be looking at brackish water in a particular area.
Okay, Ken, you are a history expert and a history major, and so I've been thinking about this, and I'd like to ask you about it. John Conley, Senator Parkhouse, a lot of names from the past that were powerful political figures who were very focused on water. And it seems to me that until about 8 years ago or so, 10 years ago or so, that was not the situation in the state for about 20 or 30 years. And then all of a sudden, being on House Natural Resources or Senate Natural Resources became a plum assignment again. And the number of water bills being filed increased. And now it's clear when you look at some of the political leaders in the state that they are very focused on water. And so, what do you think the implications of that are?
Well, I actually might disagree with you a little
Okay.
bit about the historical aspects of state leadership on water. I first, I first became aware, if you will, of Texas water issues back with the 1968 water plan and the 1969 vote on the bonds of whether to bring water from the Mississippi River, which was going to be generously given up by everybody else in the southeastern part of the country and sent to Texas to meet all of our water needs, including continuing, production in the high plains by pumping the water uphill over hundreds of miles using nuclear power plants. At any rate, that's when I first became aware of this. And over the years, I was not terribly involved for a while, but once I got involved with some water quality planning processes in the Sierra Club and all that, I've actually seen a lot of important, significant achievements made by the legislature. The 1983 and 85 water legislation, 85 being the successful water legislation. And there was a little bit of what I call a drought in major water legislation for a number of years, but then of course Bob Bullock took up the call in 96 and 97 with the passage of SB 1. Then we had SB 2, which was pretty important for groundwater and other reasons in 2001. Then more recently the environmental flows and other legislation. So I think it's sort of, pardon the term, ebbed and flowed. But I think part of the reason why perhaps there's more focus or more visibility today is simply the drought situation that we've had, especially in 2011, which I think really impacted upon people's minds. And it's unfortunate that it takes a drought or a crisis like that to really make people, sit up and think about this. But I think it has had that impact to a large measure. Now, I will qualify that by saying that I'm still afraid that many people in urban areas just don't get the extent of the water challenges that we face. Because, if you're in the city of Austin right now, you obviously get some news about the lake levels being low. But if you're sort of stuck in central Austin, if you will, basically we've been in pretty good shape. We haven't had to water lawns, even if we're inclined to do that kind of thing. I'm just afraid that part of the challenge we have in Texas is that we've become such an urban population that a lot of people have lost their connection to the land and to the water resources of the state. They don't know where their water comes from other than you turn on the faucet, it comes out of the faucet. And so they don't really understand the depth of some of the challenges that we face.
I'm going to ask a follow-up before you ask your or make your comment.
Could I jump in? I just
Yes.
want to note that the comment you made correlates with the Atlantic multi-decadal
It
oscillation.
does. It does. Wouldn't
Darn
you say?
scientist.
Wouldn't you say the political dynamic, though, in the 50s and 60s was much more of East versus West Texas, and now it's really much more urban versus rural?
I think that's a fair assessment. It is much more urban versus rural. Much of the conflict today is, for example, over concerns by people in the rural areas about their groundwater being taken for urban populations, especially a concern that urban populations are wasting water through outdoor landscaping and other things like that. I certainly see that as a big gulf we have.
Anybody want to add anything before we go to the audience for some questions? All right. Does anybody have any questions out there in the audience? Don't be bashful. Yes, sir. You
said we have 2.7 billion acre-feet of brackish water. How much fresh water?
About twice, 5.4 billion acre feet. And that is total water in storage. Need to stress that that doesn't mean that that would be practicable to pump out. There's a bunch of other unsavory things that happen if we actually sought to pump all that water out.
Can you all hear the questions, or you want me to repeat them and then
Yeah, sorry, I should have.
you can hear them? Okay. In the back there.
I was interested in Mr. Kramer's take on the process and the defining of conservation and reuse. I was in the meeting last week here at the Water Development Board, and kind of how you see that coming along. What's your take on that?
Robert probably has a take on that too, but yes, right now the Water Development Board is in the process of taking informal public comment about the development of rules to implement House Bill 4, which is the enabling legislation for the Prop 6 SWIFT fund. And one of the key issues there is, how do you define conservation or reuse projects? Because the law says at least 20% of the funding on, I think, a 5-year cycle is to go to conservation or reuse projects, but what actually is the definition of conservation or reuse? And some people can get real creative where money is involved in trying to define conservation. For many of us, we think the best thing to do is sort of go to what is already there in terms of a conservation definition that provides at least the general basis for evaluating projects as to whether they're conservation. I'm a member of the State Water Conservation Advisory Council, which is a entity of, I think, 23 folks. Robert's also a member. And we and the predecessor entity to the Council, Water Conservation Implementation Task Force, developed and are continually updating what is known as the Best Management Practices Guide for water conservation for municipal, agricultural, industrial users. And in that BMP guide, which is available on the Water Development Board website and through a separate website, which I think may be
Save Texas
integrated. Yeah, Save Texas Water. Oh, yeah, and Stacy's also a member of the council. Oh, my God, we're all conservationists up here. Basically, we have a definition of conservation that includes things like reducing the consumption of water, reducing waste, becoming more efficient in the use of water. And that's sort of what we see as the basis for how conservation projects could be evaluated. Now, there are lots of specific questions there, like, is rainwater harvesting conservation? Is something like a toilet replacement program, it's a conservation measure, but is something that the Water Development Board could provide a loan to a municipality to actually carry out that program. So I would very much encourage people, if you have thoughts about that, and especially from my perspective, if you are really interested in promoting conservation as the priority for the state in addressing water issues, that you comment to the Water Development Board through this informal process. There is a button on the Texas Water Development Board's homepage that says SWIFT, S-W-I-F-T, State Water Implementation Fund for Texas. If you click on that, it brings up a whole menu of things, including the ability to send comments electronically to the Water Development Board. And they have a list of questions they're asking people to try to help them develop the rules. Now, this is very important, and I want to really commend the Water Development Board for doing this. They're not just coming out, the staff isn't just going behind closed doors, coming up with draft rules to implement House Bill 4, getting the board to propose those rules in the Texas Register and giving you a 30-day public review and comment where you can submit comments. They're actually going ahead of that process, and they're doing stakeholder meetings, they're having work sessions, they have this electronic comment process to get your input before they even sit down and write the draft proposed rules. So this is a perfect opportunity for you to get involved and let your views about things like what the definition of conservation or reuse is be put into the process.
Any other questions?
Good job.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I've been reading the newspaper that part of the proposals have to do with reservoirs, and I'm thinking about the effect of evaporation, and so I seem to think that it might be best if we try to store water underground, even though it's so comforting to see it when it's out there, you know you can see it. But because of our laws, but the difference between underground water and surface, is that just a no-go because of the legal situation?
Everybody hear the question? It's related to, why don't we take water from surface water where it's evaporating away and store it underground, something we call aquifer storage and recovery. The laws can complicate things, but we actually have what I call 2.5 projects in Texas. There's one in Kerrville that's been in operation for quite a while now, where they take water from the Guadalupe, treat it, and store it underground and then pull it out during their peak summer months. San Antonio has a large system where they're taking excess Edwards water when it's available, pump it to the southern part of Bexar County and inject it into the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer and then pull it out when they need it, typically during droughts. And then El Paso's had a project since mid-'80s where they treat wastewater to drinking water standards and either inject it or infiltrate it through infiltration basins right in the middle of a well field they have up there, and then pull that water back out for drinking water. One of the bills, I think Stacy actually showed that one of the issues is aquifer storage and recovery and how to make that more amenable for people to adopt. It seems like there's a lot of geology out there that's amenable to doing aquifer storage and recovery. I've got a group of folks that, or I guess I got one person who's focused on aquifer storage recovery, and we think about how do we get people to adopt it more. And part of it's just it's new technology to a lot of people, and so there's that risk there that some folks are afraid of. And then they're afraid of when they put the water in the ground, someone might drill a well nearby and take it all out.
I think that's an important question. From a legal perspective, we're working on language at TWCA and TAG right now, and one of the things that's really interesting is when you take groundwater out of the ground and you put it on channel, it becomes surface water. But under ASR and the statutes that have been adopted, when you take surface water, say in times of heavy rainfalls, and you inject it in the ground, you would think it might become groundwater. It doesn't. It stays surface water. More confusion. And part of the reason is that, as I think Todd said, or Ken, the surface water is held in trust for all of us. And if they said, oh yeah, take that surface water out, inject it in the ground, and then we lose kind of that, it might be a violation of the state's trust. So it stays state water. Well, how are GCDs going to ensure that that water stays state water and that it's not pumped? And so it's really, really legally complicated. It's not easy. I wish we could just say, let's pump that water in the ground. It's so logical. Lawyers always get in the way, but we're trying to work on ways to fix that. And I'm optimistic as I am on any of those other issues I listed, that there will be a good ASR bill next session that will hopefully facilitate those things happening.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Okay, first, in regard to the city of Austin, and you're just watching the nightly news, what stage they're in. My question is, when we know we've been in severe drought since 2011, how is it we're at this stage when we should be at this stage? I know it's a competing economic development interest. It just seems like a no-brainer to elevate the station. You're right on about city dwellers. I'm tucked away in the hills, but I met this lady in her 30s, lived in Lakeway. This was in 2011, and I'm commenting about the drought. She says, quote, "Oh yes, we're watering our lawn like crazy." It was more important to her not to lose her landscape, which obviously was a xeriscape. But anyway, that's my first question. And then my second question is, why is it as Austin elevated the stage? Second question is, when you read about T-Boone Pickens some years ago, or Hays County, buying the option, water rights, and what they did is 2 different things. And then y'all said that surface water rights, most of them are already secured. What percentage, I imagine it's pretty small, in Texas where the surface water rights are still viable?
Well, the answer to your last questions, I'm not certain about the percentage. I haven't seen a figure like that recently. And to some extent, it is more relevant if you go basin by basin. because a number of basins are pretty much totally allocated. It's probably only the basins that are, more toward the middle eastern part of the state where you're going to find any potential water rights that are available. And there are some questions about whether or not our surface water models need to be updated. Well, I don't think there's a question about it. I think they do need to be updated. But as to how off they may be in some of these calculations. So I'll see if I can find that percentage for you, but I don't know it offhand. I don't remember it offhand.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem, yeah.
It's really low, but, it's,
I don't want to get you in trouble,
Okay.
but it's just really low.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, part of the issue is with surface water rights, the senior rights, have already been issued a long time ago. And so any new water right on a river that's issued is junior in priority to every other right before it. So when the drought comes, it is the most junior rights which are, cut off. So in terms of, no, everybody. And so it used to be, we used to have something called the Wagstaff Law, which was repealed, and it seems like somehow they're trying to reconstitute it, but at any rate, so what that means is the drought comes along, you have your junior surface water right, you may not be able to use it. Unless, when it was raining, you took that water with your junior water right and you stored it underground or stored it off channel or did something like that. So, new surface water rights are maybe not going to provide as much utility. Anyway, I don't know.
Right. No, I think that's a key point. Even if there is surface water available yet to be allocated, the fact is it's going to be junior to any other water rights that have been issued in the respective basin, and so the value of that water in terms of a severe drought situation is highly questionable. You may not have access to that water. With regard to your first question, you're sort of speaking to the choir here, believe me, is that I've contended all along that, with some exceptions, a number of entities with drought contingency plans have not set their trigger levels at a stage or at a point where they really should be, putting those drought contingency plans into practice at a much earlier time. And there are pros and cons to what you use as your trigger level. A lot of entities, if they are dependent upon groundwater, they use groundwater aquifer levels as the trigger level. As aquifer goes down to a certain level, it triggers first stage, second stage, whatever their drought contingency plan. A lot of entities that depend upon surface water use their lake levels or whatever as the trigger levels. That makes sense in many respects, but it also makes sense to try to factor in meteorological conditions because in the case of, I believe I'm correct in saying that in Austin, the lake levels were pretty high as of October 2010, right before the worst single-year drought started. And so Austin's drought restrictions did not really kick in until those lake levels started dropping, even though we were going months without rainfall in the lake's watershed. And I'm trying to remember, I may be stating this somewhat wrong, but I know, and it may have changed now, but as of 2011, the city of Corpus Christi did not even go into, I think, their first stage of drought contingency plan, which was voluntary cutbacks, until their reservoir levels were down to 50%. That was the trigger level for their drought contingency plan. And so there weren't any even voluntary requests for reduction in water use until they got to that stage. That is insane from my perspective. And so I think, if you're interested in looking at, say, your city or your, maybe water district, whatever, and what their drought contingency plans are, that might be a good thing for you to do to see what their trigger levels are.
And I'll just note that, when folks are putting together, water suppliers are putting together drought contingency plans, arguably it was more hypothetical, and then we went into the serious drought. And so there's been a lot of revising going on, including Austin did some revisions as well. address concerns that were out there, whether it came from they were too restrictive or if they were, they weren't restrictive enough.
And
In the drought contingency plan, sounds like that each entity comes up with it themselves. Is there like a template that the legislature passed, you should do this, and then they tailor-made, or?
There is a go-by. Theoretically, every water provider in the state, of which there's 4,300 of them or so, is supposed to have a drought contingency plan. Those with 3,300 or more connections, which is equivalent to about 10,000 people or more, have to file it with the state, TCQ. Those 3,300 connections or less are supposed to have one on file that can be viewed upon request.
And I think you hit on a public education issue where we have we have conservation plans, we have drought contingency plans, we have GCDs that have drought contingency plans. What do they all mean? How is the public supposed to process that? You've also got situations where Lakeway might be at this stage, but right next door in Austin, they're at a different stage. Well, we're all using the same water source. So I know at the Water Conservation Advisory Council, we talk about helping those to get standardized and educating the public on what that means and the difference between conservation on one hand and reaction to drought on the other, because reaction to drought is not the same thing as what we want to implement conservation, which is all the time.
Another example of that'd be the Edwards Aquifer Authority declaring stage 3 drought this summer, and most of the communities going into stage 3 drought restrictions, but San Antonio water system staying in stage 2.
Right.
Right.
Because of ASR.
Right, because they
Right,
have
'cause of
other.
ASR. One good positive development is I understand that, I don't know if it's all of the water entities, but most of the water entities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area are going to go to a standardized drought contingency stage setup. And so it's been a problem, as Stacy pointed out, for example, in the Dallas area, if, say, the city of Fort Worth is in stage 2, they have certain restrictions on their customers, but let's say Arlington, is in stage 1, or maybe stage 2 doesn't mean the same thing in terms of the restrictions and all that. Well, the entities that supply water up in north central Texas and Dallas-Fort Worth area are coming up with a standard set of stages for their drought contingency plans. Now, the triggers may be different, but basically they're going to try to have the same restrictions if possible, for each of their similar stages, so that they can use, media in the area and not send a confusing signal or confusing message to the people in the area who may be living in different jurisdictions but have the same, watching the same TV show or something like that.
And we're also seeing across the state, particularly since 2011, water providers making twice a week watering standard requirement. Most folks have learned you don't really need the water more than twice a week in Texas if you're doing it right. And arguably, probably get away with just doing it once a week if you're doing it right.
Or not at all.
Or not at all.
Yeah.
And then there's something in the conservation subculture known as a drought shadow, where when a community goes through a serious drought and there's drought restrictions and people become aware of water supply, that on the other side, there's a permanent decrease in the amount of water usage because people have become educated about the importance of their water supplies. They learn more about how to effectively water their yards, or they've simply taken their yards out or minimized their turf by putting in xeriscaping. In my neighborhood in Austin, I see quite a bit of that happening, where folks have either taken out their yard completely or replaced 50% of it with xeriscape.
Mike had a question.
Okay, last question, Mike.
With the North Texas water purveyors coming and doing all the standardization, the mayors several years ago tried to make permanent the restrictions that were enforced during the heat of the drought in 2011. There was a potent political backlash. Has that backlash been, is the potency been diminished, or what do you expect would happen?
Yes, it has. It was the mayors of Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, and Irving. And the 4 mayors in April of 2010, I can't remember which year now. I think it was 2011. They announced that, maybe 2012, sorry. 2012. They announced that they were going to get their cities to adopt the no more than twice a week watering on an ongoing basis because they've been so successful in their drought contingency plan implementation in cutting back on non-essential water use. Well, City of Dallas proceeded to do it, and so City of Dallas actually did adopt that, and so it's been in place for a couple of years now, and they are very pleased with their record in their situation. And the mayor of Dallas last year during the House Natural Resource Committee hearings on House Bill 4 said that basically that one measure alone, restricting to no more than twice a week watering, was going to defer a major water project for them for at least 10 years. That was pretty powerful. Now, when I think either the Dallas mayor did a better job of getting his council lined up before the vote, or it was just the timing of things. But in Irving and Arlington, Fort Worth, you ran into some, protestants at the council meetings, and really only a handful, and sort of, made some of the city council people stop. But there is an active effort underway right now in Fort Worth to get that back before the city council and get that adopted this year. And I know that Tarrant Regional Water District is really pushing that, probably largely behind the scenes. There was a CBS News affiliate spot about that just earlier this week in Fort Worth. And so we're beginning to see that come back around. And I think the fact that the city of Dallas has had such a positive response to it, they haven't had any citizen backlash on it, that's going to help potentially get it passed in Irving and Arlington and Fort Worth this year.
All right. Please help me thank our contestants.